say my head, or part of some person's head, or perhaps it was a place where two caves gave the appearance of the eye sockets of a skull. Now, having read from Martin's book written in 1988, let me say that I have since come across further interesting information on this point. Now, let me quote from a website called lamplighter.net. What did Golgotha mean? The place of the skull has an interesting history. The location of Jesus' crucifixion is called both Calvary and Golgotha. The Greek word Kraemer, translated as Calvary, means skull. That part of the skeletal frame known as the cranium. The word Golgotha is a Hebrew word which also means skull, better known as the place of the skull. Why was Jesus crucified on a hill known as the place of the skull? In Genesis 3:15, we have the first prophecy of the coming of our Lord Jesus to be the Savior of mankind. And I will put hostility between you, meaning Satan, and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall crush your head, and you shall bruise his heel. The crushing of Satan's head is our first clue as to why Jesus was crucified on Calvary, the place of the skull. Moses prophetically writes that there will come a time when the future seed of a woman will crush the head of the serpent. As we move from Genesis further into the Bible, we receive another installment of information that sheds light on the fulfillment of this prophecy. In 1 Samuel 17, we read about David's battle with Goliath of Gath. After David slays the giant, he cuts off his head and brings it to Jerusalem. Victors would often decapitate their foe and then set them on a hill or a site that would display victory for all to see. The fact that David brought Goliath's head to Jerusalem is quite astonishing, since Jerusalem at this time was inhabited by David's enemies, the Jebusites. The question is, where did David bring the head of Goliath? The scripture doesn't tell us, but I don't think I would be going too far out on a limb to suggest that the giant's skull was buried on Calvary. The significance of Jesus being crucified on Calvary, the place of the skull, was to show his victory over his enemy Satan, thus fulfilling the prophecy in Genesis 3:15. As the nail would have been driven through the heels of the one crucified, the prophecy of Genesis 3:15 was partially fulfilled. Satan would bruise his heel. The remainder of the prophecy was fulfilled as Jesus was lifted above the ground, the place of the skull, crushing the head of Satan. Jesus was literally in a position over his enemies, over the giants of evil. Now, back to Martin. The centurion and the tearing of the temple curtain. Wherever Golgotha is, the preponderance of mainstream scholarly opinion favors the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as having the best credentials. But there is a vigorous minority who defend the region of the Garden Tomb. Yet both must admit that no definite evidence has been forthcoming to substantiate either of these locations. But pre-4th century records show that there was indeed one particular place in the area of Jerusalem to which Christians displayed attention for special worship, but that place was not at the site of the Holy Sepulchre or in the region of the modern Garden Tomb. So where is that particular place that might have been associated with our Lord's crucifixion? There is an event associated with Christ's death, which has not been considered by most people as having any bearing on the identification of the crucifixion site. But had this one fact been recognized, the actual location would never have been lost. Let's look at the scene of the crucifixion as described by Luke. Note carefully his account of the tearing of the temple curtain. Read Luke 23:44 here. And it came, and it was already about the 6th hour, and darkness came over the whole land till the 9th hour. at this defaulting of the sun. Now rent is the curtain of the temple in the middle, and shouting with a loud voice, Jesus said, Father, into thy hands am I committing my spirit. Now saying this, he expires. Now the centurion, perceiving what is occurring, glorified God, saying that really this man was just. And all the throngs which came along together to behold this, beholding the occurrences, beating their chests, returned. Now, all those known to him and the women who followed him with him from Galilee stood afar off, seeing these things. The Gospel of Matthew reverses the events involving the tearing of the temple curtain at Christ's death. Matthew 27:50. Now Jesus, again, crying with a loud voice, lets out the Spirit, and lo, the curtain of the temple is rent in two from above to the bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks are rent. So, one way or the other, it is important to note that Christ's death and the severing of the curtain were regarded by the two gospel writers as one synchronous event, observable by all who were witnesses at the crucifixion site. Let me repeat, Luke 23:47. Now the centurion, perceiving what is occurring, glorified God, saying that really this man was just. In this account, Luke lays emphasis on the fact that the centurion could see the unusual events that were occurring, and that prompted him to exclaim that Jesus was truly righteous. And of course, these synchronous and unusual events were the last loud death exclamation of Christ, the earthquake, and the tearing of the temple curtain. Mark, for a third witness, confirms this. Now Jesus, letting out a loud sound, expires, and the curtain of the temple is rent in two from above to the bottom. Now the centurion, who stands by opposite him, perceiving that, crying thus, he expires, said, truly, this man was the Son of God. Now there were women also beholding from afar, among whom was Mary Magdalene, and also Mary, the mother of James the Little, and Joseph, and Salome. It is this situation that allows us to identify the general region of Christ's crucifixion. The truth is, there was only one place within the environs of Jerusalem where this centurion could have witnessed the tearing of the temple curtain and still be outside the gate of Jerusalem, as the book of Hebrews informs us. This would of necessity have been in an easterly direction from the temple. The reason for this is simple to understand. This is because the temple curtain that could be seen from outside the temple, and which was suspended from a large stone support or lintel, covered the eastern entrance to the holy place. This curtain was located directly in front of the eastern doors of the holy place, and only from the eastern side of the temple could this curtain be seen by spectators located outside the wall of Jerusalem. It would have been a physical impossibility for anyone to have seen the curtain from the south, north, or west. This means that anyone near the present area of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or even around the Garden Tomb, would only have been able to see the back walls of the temple. In no way was it possible to view the temple curtain hanging in front of the holy place from any area around Jerusalem other than from the east. Again, let me repeat that everyone in the general vicinity of the crucifixion saw these things happen. Luke 23. Now the centurion, perceiving what is occurring, glorifying God, saying that really this man was just, and all the throngs which came along together to behold this, beholding the occurrences, beating their chests, returned. Now all those known to him, the women who followed him from Galilee, stood afar off, yet they were seeing these things. This means that not only was the site in an easterly direction, but it had to be at an elevated area higher than the eastern wall of the temple in order to see the temple curtain. Thus, they were situated somewhere up the slopes of the Mount of Olives, and probably near its summit. It must be realized that there was no difficulty in witnessing the tearing of the temple curtain from the Mount of Olives, which was a Sabbath day's journey of about a half a mile away from the Temple Mount. And we know this from Acts 1:12. Then they returned into Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath's journey. This outer curtain, according to Martin, I've read other descriptions of it, but he says it was 55 cubits high and 16 cubits wide, which is over 80 feet tall and 24 feet in breadth. This curtain was a magnificent creation of art. Josephus, who was an eyewitness of it, described it as a wonderfully made tapestry woven with the finest materials, and how majestic it was. Imagine a curtain about 24 feet wide and as high as a modern 8-story building. It is important to realize how enormous in size this curtain was, because one might wonder how people standing about a half a mile distant could witness it tear from top to bottom. But when it is understood how large its dimensions were, all problems of distance vanish away. A Jewish Christian work of the early 2nd century called the Gospel of the Nazarenes said that the large stone lintel which supported the curtain split in two when the curtain was severed. Remember that the earthquake that happened at the precise time of Christ's death could have been the cause for the fracturing of this stone lintel. The collapse of the overhead lintel, which was an enormous stone, at least 30 feet long and probably weighing 30 tons, was the natural cause, so to speak, of the curtains tearing in two. It was likely the tremendous force of each half of the lintel falling away from its center that caused the curtain to rend in half. Number 4, the place. In Acts and John, we find a location that is called the place, which is topos in the Greek. The same location is called or referred to in other places simply by the place with no other description attached to it, the place of the city, or the holy place. The Gospel of John at chapter 19, verse 20, tells us where the crucifixion was nearby. But because almost all English versions fail to understand this place as a particular place, they bungle their translation. Even the concordant translation does no better. As the others, they read something like this. This title, referring to the sign above Christ's head, this title then, many of the Jews read, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. All this tells us is that Jesus was crucified somewhere near the city, which is obviously very vague. But John was actually being much more specific. The Darby translation is the only version that I found that does a better job of correctly translating. It reads, this title, therefore, many of the Jews read, for the place of the city where Jesus was crucified was near, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, Latin. The difference between the two translations is this. One is saying the place of the crucifixion was somewhere near the city, while the other one is saying that the crucifixion happened near a location that was called the place of the city. If this translation is correct, then there is something or some location in the city that is known simply as the place of the city. And again, if this is correct, we should look for this particular usage of this word elsewhere in the Bible and to see if it is connected to a place that we know of by a different name. So let's take a look at Acts 6:13 and 21:28. Besides, they put false witnesses on the stand who say, this man does not cease speaking, making declarations against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him saying that this Jesus, the Nazarene, will be demolishing this place and will be changing the customs which Moses gives over to us. In Acts 21, men, Israelites, help. This is the man who is teaching all men everywhere against the people and the law and this holy place. Besides, still more, he led Greeks also into the sanctuary and has contaminated this holy place. Okay. All right. Lost my spot here for a second. All right. Okay. Once again, I think this audience is familiar enough with the context of these verses to know that without mentioning the temple, we all know that this place refers to the temple and or the Temple Mount. John 4:20. Our fathers worship in this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is the place where one must worship. Note that this verse does not say that our fathers must worship in the place called Jerusalem, but that in Jerusalem was the place where they must worship. And that, of course, is the temple. John 11:48. And if we should be believing him thus, all will be believing in him, and the Romans will come and take away the place as well as the nation. And of course, that was referring to the priests and Pharisees saying that we have to kill Jesus, otherwise the Romans will destroy this place as well as the nation. Yes, here we have the official pronouncement of the chief priests and Pharisees within the Sanhedrin. In the clearest terms, they refer to the temple simply by the name place. The red heifer altar. The book of Hebrews has geological information about the place where Christ was crucified, yet there's hardly anyone who recognizes the significance today. The offerings for sin were burnt on an altar outside a gate of Jerusalem, and they were typical of Christ at his crucifixion. This is one of the principal sections of the New Testament which proves that Christ was crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem. But where outside? Where was that altar that the book of Hebrews has reference to? Hebrews 13:10. We have an altar from which they, meaning the priests, have no right to be eating, who offer divine service in the tabernacle. For the animals whose blood is carried into the holy places by the chief priests concerning sin, of these the bodies are burned up outside the camp. Wherefore Jesus also, that he should be hallowing the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Now then, we may be coming out to him outside the camp, carrying his reproach. This altar was a well-known holy place to the inhabitants of Jerusalem in the time of Christ. There were three types of sin offerings that were killed within the precincts of the temple that had their blood sprinkled before the inner curtain of the temple, and then had their bodies carried out of the camp to be burned to ashes. The main symbolic emphasis of the book of Hebrews to the rituals of the Old Covenant deals with Christ's fulfillment of the Day of Atonement sacrifices for sins. It was this outside altar that became the important altar for Christians to retreat to have forgiveness of sins. But why this particular altar? Because the sacrifices on this altar were the prime ones which dealt with the sins of Israel, and they prefigured precisely what Christ would be doing for all mankind at his crucifixion. The location for burning these sin offerings was to be in a clean place. See Leviticus 4:12. The Jewish authorities have maintained records which show the location of this clean place. They show that, again, it was east of the sanctuary. In the time of Moses, this holiest region was on the east side in front of the entrance to the tent sanctuary. The book of Hebrews consistently used the theme of the tabernacle of the wilderness as its standard and model in showing how Christ fulfilled the Mosaic rituals. There is only one entrance for people to enter the tabernacle, and that was on its east side. The region east of the temple and up the slopes of the Mount of Olives was reckoned as the holiest part of Jerusalem surrounding the temple. One of the main reasons for this was because the sin offering, known as the red heifer, was killed and burnt to ashes in this area outside the camp. See Numbers 19:1-22. Notice Ezekiel also speaks of this altar at some distance from the temple. And you have taken the bullock of the sin offering and have burnt it in the appointed place of the house at the outside of the sanctuary. The red heifer was considered one of the holiest of Israel's offerings. Its ashes were saved, and periodically part of the ashes was mixed with pure water. The sprinkling of this water purified a person for a number of important ceremonial functions associated with the temple and the camp of Israel. See Numbers chapter 19. These purification rituals at this site were understood by all Jews of the time. And this is why it was essential that Christ was crucified near the spot where the purification for Israel were ordained to take place, which was on the top of the Mount of Olives. And again, note in contrast that the present site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Garden Tomb have nothing to do with any Old Covenant ritual. Number 6, the cross. I've only covered about 15% of Martin's book, but I want to skip to an interesting subject found briefly at the end of it that deals with the actual cross. Did this so-called cross look like our traditional church crosses? Was it two pieces of lumber nailed together, or was it simply one pole in the ground with the hands of Jesus being nailed to that one pole straight above his head? Or was it even a living tree? There are arguments over this. The confusion comes from the different Greek words used to describe it. And how many times have we talked about different Greek words causing confusion? The New Testament uses 3 different words that cause this confusion. Number 1 is dendron, which is usually translated tree. In the concordant, it is consistently regards a living tree. Most often, I believe it's a fig tree, but sometimes an olive tree, maybe other trees as well. Now, another word is staros, which is most usually translated as cross. And this cross can be in regards to bearing the cross of one's burdens. Or B, it can be in regard to an actual physical upright, such as the crucifixion cross or pole, if you like. And the third word is zulon. Now, zulon is more of a generic word, and it can refer to many wooden items, things made out of wood. And it is translated in many different ways, even by the concordant version, which likes to be very consistent, but it can't be in this case. For instance, it is translated as stocks, as in the locks for head, hands, and feet. I believe the apostles at one time were locked into these stocks. Or B, it can just refer to any kind of wood, dry wood, like lumber, which obviously comes from a tree. C, it can be translated as a cudgel, which means a wooden club. And again, could be almost like a branch from a tree. Or D, it can be a pole, or referring to something upright. But then again, a tree is something that is upright, and it could be referring to the tree or pole of the crucifixion. And E, the concordant uses the word log to translate it. And in the book of Revelation, they talk about the log of life, which most translations translate as the tree of life. So, because 3 different words are used, with at least 2 of them having some flexibility in their usage, this has led to confusion. For instance, the Jehovah's Witnesses teach that Jesus was crucified on a pole because the Greek word can mean an upright made out of wood. That is true, but so is a tree an upright thing made out of wood. And while the concordant version uses the phrase log of life, almost everyone else uses the phrase tree of life. Now, this needs to be studied at length, but I'm not going to bore everybody with that. Let me get to something more interesting. Martin noticed that the Apostle John used the word staros in the singular number to describe the instrument on which 3 men, Christ and the 2 robbers, were executed. None of the Gospels state that the 3 were crucified on 3 separate stakes of execution. All 3 were crucified on the same staros, meaning the same stake, or, which in this case may have been a tree. And where we get this from is John 19:31. The Jews then, since it was the preparation, lest the bodies, plural, should be remaining on the cross, singular, on the Sabbath, for it was the great day, that Sabbath, asked Pilate that they might be fracturing their legs, and they may be taken away. Because it seemed absurd to imagine that 3 men could have been crucified together on one Latin typical cross that we usually think of, Martin dismissed the matter as a grammatical oddity without any significance. But if this staros referred to an upright made of wood, it could be a pole, but it could also be a living tree. And it is a lot easier to imagine three men nailed to a single large tree than to a single pole. It would also be easier for the Romans to nail their victims to a lumber crosspiece and then nail the crosspiece to a strong, large living tree instead of digging holes deep enough to support a very long pole. Now, what comes into your mind at this time? The tree of life or the pole of life? This also means that Jesus would only have carried his crosspiece of lumber from the judgment seat up to the top of the Mount of Olives. Can you imagine how heavy a full two-piece cross would have been? The upright pole section would have had to have been a thick piece of lumber up to 8 or 10 feet long in order to be secured into the ground. This may well have been impossible for one person to carry uphill, but just the single crosspiece that was nailed to the tree would have been possible. Also, the large sign in 3 languages above Jesus' head would also have been easier to nail to the tree than to the top of this pole. Now, let me get back to the 2 criminals that were crucified with Jesus. Luke 23:33. And when they came away to the place called Skull, where they crucify him and the malefactors, one indeed at the right, yet the other at the left. In John 19:18. Where they crucify him, and with him 2 others, hence and hence. Yet in the midst, or in the middle, is Jesus. In spite of the agony and labored breathing of crucifixion, the 3 were able to speak to each other. Why? Because they were so close together if they were on the same tree. Now notice that while John says Jesus was in the middle, look at the order in which the Roman soldier broke their legs. If the 3 of them were in a long straight line or row, this was not likely to have happened. But John 19:32. The soldiers then came and fractured indeed the legs of the first and of the other who was crucified together with him. Yet, coming on to Jesus, as they perceived he had already died, they do not fracture his legs. If they were in a straight row, it doesn't make sense that the soldiers broke the first man's legs, then skipped by Jesus, then broke the second man's legs, and then came back to Jesus in the middle, only to now notice him dead. It is more likely that he broke the first man's legs, then continued to circle around the tree to the second man and broke his legs, and then continued to circle around to come to Jesus, who was the third man and yet was in between them. It is interesting that the 3 men with their 6 raised arms and hands, with the tree in the middle of all of them, resemble the Jewish menorah, with its 1 central pillar anchored on the table and 6 more arms rising from it. For us, 2,000 years later, much of the symbolism of these holy places, altars, actually even the menorah, and rituals are lost on us. But to the devout Jews, all of this happening exactly at the time of Passover would have struck them soundly. No wonder many thousands of them accepted Jesus soon afterwards. and they were willing to die for their new covenant. Thank you for your attention. I pray that that was interesting and of spiritual benefit. Over to you.